chance to hear it, study it, and practice it. We vow to realize its true meaning. The Dharma is vast and subtle. We now have a chance to hear it, study it, and practice it. We vow to realize its true meaning. Dharma is vast and subtle. We now have a chance to hear it, study it, and practice it. We vow to realize its true meaning. Can you all hear me? Cool. So good evening, everyone, and good evening, everyone joining us in the Cloud Zendo. It's the first time it's been this dark since I've given a Dharma talk, and I realize I can't really read what's in front of me, so this will be great. This will be interesting. Maybe. That might be helpful. Thanks, Noah. So I want to begin by acknowledging the land that we sit on and the Tewa people whose land this has been for generations and centuries. We're going to go to Sankawi on Saturday, which is a old pueblo, kind of carved into the side of a butte. And I'm thinking of Roxanne and of Porter Swensel and of our garden. And I want to thank Roshi Joan for making this Zendo and this practice come alive. Thanks, Noah. Yeah, it's great. Now I have to give my talk. And also for Roshi's humor. We laughed a lot this morning. I didn't really know she kind of speaks Italian, and Eddie and Roshi were going back and forth with each other, which was pretty fun. But also for this past Rohatsu, for her teachings, and for Roshi Enkyo and Kaz. It was a really beautiful Rohatsu. So tonight I thought we would talk about meditation. Which is a funny thing to talk about in Zen, because Zen means meditation. But I've been going through the paramitas, the 6 paramitas over the course of the year almost. Gave a couple talks on generosity, a couple talks on Shila or on ethical conduct, and then recently on equanimity or patience and on joyful effort. So we've covered the first 4 paramitas, and the 5th paramita is meditation. And so this is the time we have to talk about meditation, even though it seems like every Dharma talk is maybe about Zazen. So I've been thinking about how we get into Zazen from a different angle. I'm not, since this is a talk on meditation, we've already done the talk. Like the first 15 minutes was the real marrow of the talk. So the most of the talk's over. This is just kind of the extra stuff, like the capping verse. I'm not going to go through the basics of meditation. We're not going to do a guided meditation. That's one way to get into the 5th paramita, in part because on Sunday, I'll be leading Ease and Joy of mornings, which is a morning where we just sit, and a morning where we read Dogen's Fukan Zazengi, instructions on meditation. So if you haven't joined for that, or if you're called to that, it's maybe my favorite, as I always say, maybe my favorite thing we do here. Come. A few of us will be here in the Zendo. A few of us. But I wanted to enter Zazen from another direction. And so I was sitting just before the talk and was missing having the Zendo filled with people for Dharma talks. Because I like people, that's one reason. But the other is that in a talk like this is the kind of talk where I just kind of want to throw things out and see what we end up talking about. And it's a talk where I'm going to delve into a book that I'm not deeply versed in. So if anyone who's joining us online has questions or wants to continue the conversation or wants to engage in a different way, I wish we were on Zoom and we could kind of do it live, but we're not. So I'm going to say email me. Email me at kozan@upaya.org, and let's continue the conversation beyond this talk, which frees me up to give a weird Dharma talk tonight, I hope. So the book I want to start with, so another thing about giving a talk on Zazen. So there's always the like, why are we talking about silent illumination? Why are we talking about the thing instead of doing it? And I think this is a fair question. But the reason we talk about it, the reason we read about it, is to refer back to the map of our practice. The map is not the territory, but the map helps bring us back to ourselves, bring us back to where we are. And so that's part of what I hope tonight is. And the two things I want us to look at are this book, which I'm going to talk about, and then a fascicle of Dogen's. So I want to start with this book. Has anyone read this book? It's The Zen Teachings of Homeless Kodo. So this is a book I've had on my shelf for a few years now. And I was maybe my first month at divinity school and studying many other traditions. And I went up to my professor, the kind of one professor who stood out for me in my first semester, and also actually my whole time there, was Professor Charles Hallisey. And he was a translator of Pali. He's a great scholar of Buddhist sutras. He taught kind of Buddhist philosophy and comparative religious philosophy. And when I told him I was a Zen priest, he said, there's only one book I think people should read about Zen. I said, oh. He said, this book. And he gave it to me. And I opened it and it didn't land. And so I opened it and I read like 20 pages. And then for some reason, a few weeks ago, I saw it on my shelf and I picked it off my shelf. And I opened it and I was like, oh, he's right. This is maybe the only book you have to read. Not quite, but close. And so it just hit home. So this is also a book that I think is dear to our lineage and our tradition. So we go back to Uchiyama Roshi's Opening the Hand of Thought a lot. And Kodo Sawaki Roshi is Uchiyama Roshi's teacher. So this is where he draws a lot of his inspiration, and a lot of that is in this book. And this book is actually Uchiyama Roshi in the years after his teacher dies, writing just single sentences in the local paper about religion and giving about a few paragraphs saying his understanding of those sentences. And then later, his student, Shohaku Okumura, whose books we also read quite often here, particularly in the Mountains and Rivers Sutra, on the vows, he is then giving another gloss. So this is essentially chapters that are a sentence or two from Sawaki Roshi, and then these glosses from his two students, his student and his student's student. You with me so far? So this is the book. So a little bit about Kodo Sawaki Roshi, and then I just want to read from this, from a couple of these very short chapters. So he's called Homeless Kodo because he supposedly never stayed still. He was constantly traveling from temple to temple. And even when he became abbot of Intaiji, he was the fifth abbot of Intaiji, he wasn't there. Uchiyama Roshi ran the place for him. is how the story goes. And he would just go from temple to temple. And this is the 40s and 50s and very early 60s. And this is before cell phones. And, they had phones, but apparently he would just show up at a temple unannounced, be like, I'm going to be here for a little while, and then kind of leave unannounced, and would just constantly be on the road like a pilgrim priest, teaching the Dharma, sharing rice, practicing. And he's most famous for saying, I wasted my whole life sitting Zazen. And that was his kind of teaching. He just wasted his whole life away sitting Zazen. And this was what his students kind of loved about him, was his sense that Zazen wasn't for anything, wasn't to get anything. And I think that's what we'll hear him say. He had, at his death, 6 male Dharma heirs and 10 female Dharma heirs. And interestingly, Antaiji just switched over their abbot. There's now, their 10th abbot is a woman. Their 9th abbot was a German priest. Both of those things very uncommon in Japanese temples. So it's this lineage of a kind of open, uncommon, against the stream, in and against the stream tradition temple and practice. This wonderful lineage in Japan. So the other side of Kodo Sawaki was that he fought in World War II. He was quite decorated in World War II, and he's pretty controversial for his actions. He took life during that war. People of his generation really praised him for that. There's a whole side of his life I've only read a little bit about, but he's not an uncontroversial figure. And I'm going to tell this part of his story because it reminds me of Charles Hallisey and something he said. But a student once asked Uchiyama Roshi what he thought of this part of Sawaki's life. And he said, Sawaki Roshi fought in World War II. So many of his generation, including him at times, glorified war. He's killed people, and he wasn't as repentant as others had been. What do you say to this, Akamura? Sorry, it was Akamura Roshi who was asked. And Akamura said in response, I have no words. Sawaki Roshi isn't dangerous anymore, but we still are. And that really pierced me reading it. And it really pierced me because in my year studying with Hallisey, Professor Hallisey, he would sit in the front of class and he'd put a really simple kind of 4 or 5 or 6 point outline of what he was going to teach for the next hour and a half. And then he'd stay on point 1 for the next 75 minutes. He just wouldn't go anywhere. He'd just talk about life and Buddhist sutras. He was incredibly captivating. And one of those classes, he was talking about the Dhammapada, I think. And somehow we got onto some literary academic paper, collection of papers, particularly Buddhist academics, that had asked him to write for them. And he was expressing to us for some reason that he was hesitant. And he suddenly said, I told them, I'm dangerous. Don't you understand? I'm not good. I'm very dangerous. And he said it in this way where he meant it. The sweetest human with this southern drawl, he could draw you in by elongating a word for seconds on end. And so direct and present. And he really meant it to us. Don't you remember, we're all capable of hurting each other. We all think each other innocent, but we're part of this life. We're part of this whole life. And I think in particular, in his case, he was talking about structures of power and a whole bunch of things we don't have to get into. But this was Akamura's response. Sawaki Roshi isn't dangerous anymore, but we still are. We can be confused in our actions. We can cause harm. And if we wield power, we're all the more so capable of this. And maybe this is what drives us to practice, because we know we're not neutral in this life. Maybe it's this realization that is no different from our aspiration to wake up. So this is part of Sawaki Roshi's story, and Nakamura and Uchiyama's story. And the two things that Sawaki comes back to in our Zazen practice are things that Dogen writes about in Fukan Zazengi, which is letting go of words and phrases, of name and gain, that this is vital, that this isn't a self-improvement program when we're sitting Zazen, when we're practicing Zen. And this is the practice of non-attainment. And the other is the emphasis of harmonizing our body and our mind, harmonizing all activities that we engage in with all beings, or the practice of non-separateness. So, what is Zazen? Maybe ask yourself that before we get into the book. What is Zazen? You don't need an answer, but does anyone have an answer?
It's a habit.
It's a habit. What kind of habit?
This one.
Okay. Yeah, this habit. Exactly this habit. Anyone else? That's another habit.
I think when I remember, you keep telling me it's like Zazen is your life.
Zazen is your life. Yeah. Yeah.
Honestly, now thinking about it, it's, maybe the word is onomatopoeic.
Onomatopoeic, like it sounds like what it is?
Yeah, Zazen.
Ah, Zazen. Yeah. But I think Noah was reminding us of that. Yeah, so it's all those things. And I think when we have a good shout, we remember. And sometimes a good shout's just a loud noise. So some of these are kind of his shouts. And for some of us, maybe we'll hear them and they'll bring us back, and maybe they'll just be wind in the trees. So this is the 37th chapter, called Halfway Zen. Kodo Sawaki, it begins with always a line by him. He says, a Zen Tanma, or heavenly demon, is an ordinary person practicing to gain satori, to become great. A Tenma, or heavenly demon, is an ordinary person practicing to gain satori, or to become great. Buddha Dharma is not something for making an ordinary person great. People say you can cultivate the hara, as part of our belly, by doing zazen. To know we don't need such hara is the real hara, the true stability. Menkosho Uchiyama writes, some people take for granted that the goal of Zen practice is to achieve satori and become courageous. Others believe that Zen is an evil practice. But the Zazen transmitted by Shakyamuni Buddha, Buddha Dharma, Dogen Zenji, and Sawaki Roshi is nothing other than a true religion that teaches us to take final refuge in this life. True Zazen is not something that satisfies an ordinary human being's half-baked desires, such as the desire to make money or succeed in the world, even to find a cure for disease. Such desires are half-baked because all these achievements must be cast aside when we die. Satisfying these desires cannot be a stable way of living as long as we can die at any moment. For the same reason, the Zazen that gives us satori and the courage to frighten off the bill collector with a yell is also half-baked. Any teaching that professes to make an ordinary person great is a heavenly demon. From the standpoint of ordinary human beings, the Zazen he taught, Sawaki Roshi, is good for nothing. It's simply the practice of true religion. And religion in this book is a word with, it's a compound, truth and teaching. So it's simply true teachings, or the practice of true teachings. When we practice Zazen with this attitude, what happens in our minds is the same as when we struggle for fame. Sorry. This is now Shahaku Okumura. When we have difficulty, we might start to practice Zazen to find a way out. Some people seek worldly success with meditation, using it as a training in concentration, spontaneity, bravery. Others aspire to be released from everyday life by some kind of enlightenment experience. Either way, we search because we feel lack. When we practice Zazen in this way, with this attitude, what happens in our minds is the same as when we struggle for fame and profit. As long as we practice Zazen with seeking mind, we create samsara within our practice. Receiving gifts or blessings from our practice is no problem as long as they aren't our motivation. If they are, then we're only doing halfway Zen. So I love the notion that Zazen isn't good for anything. And that actually it has to be good for nothing. That if we practice for attainment, we sit, and when we're practicing, we're sitting in the realm of our desire for attainment. We bring all of our notions, all of our self stuff with us. And then we sit kind of waiting around, playing or splashing around. We're just sitting in our desire for our life to be other than it is. What did you say, Joel? What is Zazen? Your life, just as it is. So Sawaki comes back to this again and again, that we practice just sitting without changing anything, without getting anywhere. And not just that, but without indulging our kind of self-help, self-improvement instincts. And that turns out to be very difficult for a lot of reasons. One is that we're encouraged to be different than we are. The other is that it turns out that's what our mind likes to go back to. And so he doesn't talk about it a lot in here, but it's why when we're thrown this way or that way, we come back to the breath in the belly and the stability of being here, which for us is our posture and our breath, the stability of not going elsewhere, which is the same as not needing things to be otherwise. This is also why we have difficulty staying kind of steady when we're sitting in Zazen. Because it can be hard to remember, what are we doing anyway? Like, really, if Zazen is just sitting and not getting good at something, I have this thought. I mean, does anyone else have this thought where you're sitting, you're like, what am I doing? One other, just me and Noah. Oh, and Nicole. Okay, so there's three of us in the room. I had the thought today, it's been almost 7 years since I moved to Upaya. Probably been practicing in some way for much longer than that, but for 7 years, dedicating my life to Zen and Zazen, which is about how long it takes to get a PhD. And I thought if I'd gotten a PhD in like physics, I wouldn't forget the formula for a falling object in Earth's gravitation. Like it would just be that I learned this. Like this is part of what I. But when you're practicing just being here and not holding on to things being otherwise, it seems like there's not anything to have learned. Like you would think it would be very clear, but it's actually the absence of it being very clear that's part of our Zazen practice, I think. So there's these moments where I'm like, what are we doing again? And that's where some of these metaphors are very useful. And there's a whole bunch of them in here. Coming back to our lives, finding a home just where you are. These are some we use often here. But here's a list of all the metaphors that Sawaki uses and Uchiyama. So you may know some of these. So one is Zen is the self selfing the self. Do you know this one? Sometimes it's translated as Zen is the self doing itself by itself. Another is our practice of Zazen is looking at the world afresh after being in hibernation. It's kind of interesting. Making everything fresh and new, really not knowing, and so things are vivid as if for the first time. Another is to practice Zazen is to stop being an ordinary human being. What do you think that one means? There's a clue in the next one. To practice Zazen is to stop looking from any point of view. And then the main one from this chapter is Zazen is like re-entering our mother's womb. Therefore, it is not a means to an end. Akamura says about that one, the baby and the womb are one and yet not the same, like a person sitting Zazen in the world. So those are some things that return me back to practice, which is returning back to not going out, not going elsewhere. And in that definition, therefore, it is not a means to an end. There's this conviction from Sawaki Roshi that Zazen should not be defiled by our desires, that that's our ends. You know, Zazen then becomes a means to our ends. But that's very tricky. And I want to mention here that he distinguishes, and Dogen distinguishes between being defiled by desire, or Zazen is just another thing we attain, or a practice is just another stepladder practice, and aspiration, which is to turn our heart and mind towards something. That aspiration may guide our energies, our attention, while desire conversely defines the parameters for success for us. And if we do not attain what we desire, we feel we have failed to succeed, which leaves little room for surprise or little room for things to be otherwise. In that way, it forecloses the possibility of living beyond ourselves before we even get started. So we can aspire to wake up. We can aspire to be good friends. We can aspire to reduce our own suffering or the suffering of the world, one and the same. But the second we desire the world to look a certain way, our practice is confined by the limitations of our imagination, what that desire will look like. Does that make sense? People disagree? Any disagreement? Can have some fun? No? Okay. So, one other chapter. And this gets to, Shinyu, your statement that Zazen is a habit, which can be a kind of inflammatory statement. Sawaki writes, "We do not practice to attain enlightenment. We practice dragged around by enlightenment." We do not practice to attain enlightenment. We practice actually dragged around by enlightenment. This really flips the script. We think we practice to attain enlightenment. We think we're dragged around by our attachments, by our suffering, by our delusion. But actually, what else would we be dragged around by but our enlightenment? If we're already Buddhas, if this moment is already perfect just as it is, what would drag us around but our enlightened nature? So Kosho Uchiyama writes, having a love affair, so this speaks to the two kinds of practice. And your practice is Sawaki's practice too. Having a love affair is ecstasy, he says. But marriage is everyday life. In life, there are rainy, windy, and stormy days. It's natural that we cannot always whisper, "I'm happy," to each other. We can say the same of Zazen. There are two streams of Zazen that have been transmitted in Japan. One understands Zazen as ecstasy, the other accepts Zazen as everyday life. Buddha's teachings are based on the idea of oneness of subject and object, self and other. A difference occurs depending whether we taste the samadhi of identity of self and other as an ecstatic psychological condition, or if we just practice it in our everyday lives. The former practice is often expressed through art, while the latter is actualized simply within our everyday life based on religion, on the truth and its teachings. Those who express the samadhi of oneness through various art forms enable others to taste that same kind of ecstasy. I think the Zen introduced by T.D. Suzuki to the world is this kind of Zazen. On the contrary, the Zazen that has been transmitted from Dogen Zenji to Sawaki Roshi is nothing other than religion. This is the same as Shinran's Nembutsu, as chanting the name of Amida Buddha. Within our everyday lives, we practice in the midst of delusion, without knowing whether we will fall to hell or be born in the Pure Land. Our Zazen and Shinran's Nembutsu are done without thinking of outcomes. We practice without expectations. Religious practice isn't something to show off, nor something we can appreciate by seeing others' performances. It exists within our effort just to be ourselves. In everyday life, there are rainy, windy, and stormy days, but whatever conditions we may encounter, we just continue to sit as the stability of our entire lives. Sawaki Roshi taught this kind of Zazen. To that, Kodo Sawaki has even more to add. If it wasn't enough that we're dragged around by enlightenment, he says, we are watched by Zazen, scolded by Zazen, obstructed by Zazen, dragged around by Zazen, and spend our entire life in tears. This is the happiest life, isn't it? This is the happiest life. So when Zazen is Zazen, you are you. This life is this life. Whether it's rainy or sunny, sun-faced Buddha or moon-faced Buddha. And when we're really courageous enough to live this life rather than some other life, it's the greatest life, isn't it? No. I think this is why Dana Paramita is giving the greatest kind of manifestation of that is giving fearlessness, as we talked about a couple months ago. That when we give the capacity or receive the capacity to not separate, to not be in fear of our life or what's in front of us, we practice in this way. We have relationships in this way, we cut carrots in this way, we sit zazen in this way, and we realize that it's better to be here than to be elsewhere in a dream. Uchiyama writes, living every day surrendering to Zazen, being protected and guided by Zazen means to live having a direction. That is, living without being pulled around by the thoughts and emotions rampaging inside us. This means to live aiming at enacting the unity of present and eternal. And Roshi Joan said something similar to us during Rohatsu, which was, you should meditate inside the life you have. So right now, can we live the life that is inside this pandemic, as well as its slow and careful ascent from the contagion of COVID and the contagion of social disorder in which we've been dwelling? Can we live inside that too? Can we meditate inside of our body and live inside of our body, this body? And inside our relationships, all of our relationships just as they are. So it's from Sawaki in this great book that I get this inspiration around our Zazen practice, that it's something absurd and profound and very simple and impossible not to do in a way. And although Sawaki talks about it, the other piece is that we're always in relationship and we're always aspiring to harmonize in the relationships we're in this world. And I have a lot to say about that and not a lot of time. So I'm going to skip this entire section and just say, if you're interested, Dogen has a great fascicle called Only a Buddha and a Buddha. I talk to Noah about it at great length all the time. He's probably glad I'm going to skip over this. And another one called The Reality of All Things, where he talks about this line in the Lotus Sutra, only a Buddha and a Buddha fully understand the reality of all things. That we're always waking up together. That when we come to the cushion with our desires, it's like coming to the cushion as if we were separate from each other or the world. We end up wrapping ourselves in our own ideas. We wake up when we dissolve self and other. And this is this wonderful phrase that Dogen plays with at great length. The only being one, being self, being the particular, being everything having its unique expression. And the and in that sentence being community, being the myriad things, the and being the friction and the harmony, the dance. And that there's always only a Buddha and a Buddha waking up. That when we sit and we practice and we live in that way. We can't actually live otherwise. He says it is like having original nature as body and letting it be original nature. No ideas covering over our nature or things as they really are. And so I'm going to skip a lot of this, but just to say that it's always relationship, that when we practice Zazen, this fifth paramita, meditation beyond meditation, we're always practicing relationship. Community, self, and the dissolution in just this moment. So Chuang-Tzu puts it this way: the entire world of the 10 directions is the true human body. The entire world of the 10 directions is within the radiant light of the self. And Roshi Joan on our website, I believe, puts it this way. Natalie Goldberg emailed me this, and we were trying to figure out who wrote it. Turns out Roshi wrote it. Zen practice is about relationship and process, and not about outcome. It involves the recognition of our sensory ecology and that we are braided with the streams of life that support us. In other words, we cannot be separated from the context of our experience, including this very world. Authentic practice is your life, your whole life, including the life of this world, its suffering, and its beauty. So I hope all that in there somewhere are useful reference, handholds, footholds, fingers pointing at the moon, all these deep practitioners pointing us back to ourselves and our relationship with each other. And I want to end, and I'm going to go a little over, I want to end with one of Dogen's koans. And the reason I want to end with this is because it's a representation of practicing together. Because it's a practice of Zazen. It's not emphasized in Soto Zen, but it's certainly part of our tradition. And it's a way in which we practice. And because we're moving into winter practice period soon, where we're going to be studying the koans. I think we'll be focusing on the Gateless Gate. This is from Dogen's 300 koan collection. And I'm going to say a little bit about it, but see if any of what the territory we just covered informs how you might let this koan penetrate you. So here's the koan. Zhuan-Sha, great master Zhang Yi, was on his way to the Dharma hall when he heard the swallow's voice. He said in his Dharma talk, "The swallow's voice deeply speaks of reality and well expounds the heart of Dharma." Then he descended from the teaching seat. Later, a monk asked him for a teaching by saying, "I don't understand it." Zhuan-Sha said, "Go away. No one believes you." Zhuan-Sha, great master Zhang Yi, was on his way to the Dharma hall when he heard the swallow's voice. He said in his Dharma talk, "The swallow's voice deeply speaks of reality and well expounds the heart of the Dharma." Then he descended from the teaching seat. Later, a monk asked him for his teachings by saying, "I don't understand it." Zhuan-Sha said, "Go away. No one believes you." So if we can read or hear this koan through the lens of only a Buddha and a Buddha, how do we understand it? What reality was expounded by the swallow's voice? What did Zhuangzi hear? What didn't the student hear? Maybe more to the point, who heard the Dharma talk? Who heard the swallow's voice? How do we hear it right now? Dogen says, "You may think that Zhuangzi's statement, 'The swallow's voice deeply speaks of reality,' means that the swallow alone deeply speaks of reality. But this is not so. He did hear the chirping of the swallows on his way. It is not that swallows were speaking of reality. It is not that Xuanxia was speaking of reality. They were not divided into two, but at that very moment, there was speaking of reality. Study this story thoroughly for now, Dogen says. There was Xuanxia walking on his way there. There was hearing the chirping of swallows. There was a statement, the swallow's voice deeply speaking of reality and well expounds the heart of the Dharma. There was descending from the teacher's seat. There was a monk asking him by saying, I don't understand it. There was Xuanxia saying, go away, no one believes you. The monk's statement, I don't understand it, was not necessarily asking about reality, but was the life vein of the Buddha ancestors, bone and marrow of the treasury of the true Dharma eye. So that's Dogen's explanation, which I think is really telling. And I think it's telling because he doesn't explain anything. He seems to be saying, do you see what's right here? Just what's right here? Let me repeat it for you. Here's what is right here. It's Xuanxia walking on his way there. There's hearing the chirping of the swallows. There's reality as reality, and activity as activity, and relationship as relationship. This is his explanation of the koan, checking if we fully see just what's there without making it something else. Dogen goes on, know that whether this monk had asked for instructions by saying, I understand it, or by saying, I speak it, Xuanxia would invariably have said, go away, no one believes you. It is not that Xuanxia said, go away, no one believes you, because the monk understood it, but said he did not understand it. Did anyone else have that thought? That the student was just kind of playing a game with him? I also like this, and it's instructive for me, because I think I had that thought when I first read this. And Dogen seems to be saying, there's no trick. It's not the teacher catching the student in a disingenuous moment. Though when we read it, we want to get something. And if we could get that as a disingenuous moment, that some turning, some phrase, then we could get this koan, an easy aha. But Dogen's saying, no, it's just the opposite. I don't understand it is a Buddha and a Buddha. Go away, no one believes you, is the swallows chirping. So I'm going to close with Dogen's words, which are his final words of this really great fascicle that I spoke very little about, the reality of all things, and also his final words on this koan. Dogen writes, indeed, even if you are an ordinary person and not like this monk, you experience the reality of all things. When reality is actualized in this way, at this time and place, you are directly connecting to the life vein of Buddha ancestors. Know that reality is an authentic vein that has been transmitted from air to air. All things are only a Buddha and a Buddha thoroughly investigated. Only a Buddha and a Buddha are splendid, just as they are. Creations are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to transform them. Reality is boundless, I vow to perceive it. The awakened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to transform them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The awakened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it.
Creations are numberless.
I
vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to transform them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The awakened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody